We are happy today to have Dawn Allen back on with us. She was on a couple of weeks ago, but she's back on today. She wanted to, again, share some additional details about her son. She also wanted to highlight some of her efforts and activities relative to making fentanyl awareness something that everybody is cognizant of. And we're especially pleased about new legislation that was passed in Washington, D.C. just a couple of days ago that will greatly help with this crisis. So, Dawn, go ahead and let's get you going.
Thank you again, Mary. I'm very grateful for the thoughtfulness that you have extended to the community that I'm in with bereft families of the fentanyl crisis. And I viewed all of them and was deeply touched and moved by so many of those stories. Some of them are people I've interacted with, but had never had the opportunity to hear the full scope. And I was particularly touched by Sarah Chittum and just some of the tragedies that her poor son had endured even before the ultimate tragedy. And it really put me in a headspace of, we know that there's so much going on outside our country, people living in, third world countries that are suffering unimaginable, circumstances. And yet we do have people in our own backyard who are living nightmares too. There are so many devastating circumstances that young people will likely come into contact with throughout the course of their lifetime. And I just was so deeply impacted by all that young man endured, and to have never really gotten justice in any of the things that he experienced. I needed to take a few moments to really digest that. And so, again, I appreciate being able to circle back with you. I think after seeing some of the other pieces that you put together, I kind of identified something within myself that I have spent so much time in the last year in this hyper-focused place of wanting to, accomplish something with this investigation, trying to figure out how this issue got so big. How did I not know about it? How can I protect my living children and grandchildren? How can I be more supportive to the other people in this community? And throughout that, I've become really kind of protective of my son's story, and everything that I know led up to what happened to him. And I have, I think, sort of avoided talking about it. And I just thought it was so brave and so generous of those mothers to give us that little snapshot of their babies. And I kind of felt a little bit sad that I didn't go that direction with our first conversation. And so I am grateful that you're extending some more time to me.
Happy
And
to
so,
do it.
and so I think our original interview, you asked me to tell you about Benjamin, and I think I immediately got to the point where we lost Ben on March 16th. But I would love to tell you that, Benjamin was this deeply loving, affectionate, kind, compassionate, forgiving, and altogether he was just an outstanding human being to his core. I mean, we have said since he passed away, we challenge ourselves to love big like Ben did. He just had a capacity to extend himself to people, and sometimes I think to his detriment, that he was so much so wanting of love in return, and often felt the only way to get that was to overextend himself. And in 2017, he was only 16 years old and was hanging out with some friends. And I think as a mom, I think we've all had times where we were like, I don't know if these are the kids I want my kid to hang out with, and who knows, my kids might be the ones that parents are like, I don't want my kids hanging out with them. But he got into a circle of friends that were definitely a little bit on the wild side. And one kid in particular, he met up with them. They took a little spin around our neighborhood, which was like a little cul-de-sac-y type space. And the kid was speeding and lost control of the vehicle, and it went into a tree, and Benjamin was ejected. He was in the back seat without his seatbelt on. And so the day that happened, we got a police officer at our front door telling us that we needed to go to the hospital, and that's all he could tell us. And so we called the hospital as we were on our way to it, and we were told to just come. And in the moments, as soon as that transition from they're not going to tell me anything, I just need to get there, I immediately accepted the possibility that I was going to get there and they were going to tell me that my son had died. And when I got to the hospital, they had me wait. And then someone came and picked us up and met us and walked us all the way to the very back of the hospital to a room that had chaplain on it, and took us into a space where a chaplain was there and a surgeon. And they basically told us Ben was in an accident. And for those moments before they said he's alive, I absolutely believed that my son was dead. And as soon as they explained to us that Benjamin's injuries were very serious and that they couldn't guarantee what the next 24 to 48 hours would look like, that he was going in for emergency surgery, but that it was a very, very serious accident. He had suffered major trauma to his brain and the frontal lobe in particular. His entire face was, all the bones in his face were broken. His orbital sockets were shattered. His neck was broken. He had a broken arm. It was really bad. And so he had his first operation immediately following that and spent a good deal amount of time in the critical care unit. When he was essentially considered out of the woods, he spent another about 6 to 8 weeks in a acute rehabilitation facility in Chicago, where they basically helped him learn how to walk. And then beyond that, he went into post-acute rehabilitation. And so that year following his accident, he was either in a hospital or in a rehabilitation facility. We took him to Dallas, Texas, to a program called the Center for Neuroskills, where they work with people who have to relearn things as basic as how to cook yourself, a cup of soup in the microwave. And so he really was essentially fighting to get his life back at a point where he was just learning how to be independent.
Wow.
And with the frontal lobe not being fully developed until 25, and with his frontal lobe being so severely damaged, and he ended up developing a staph infection after the first surgery, where they had to go in and remove all the hardware that was in there because it had been came into contact with the staph infection. And for about 3 months, he walked around with his whole front area of his head was essentially just a big dent. He had teeth missing, and there were a variety of surgeries that were not as important. So he did spend a lot of time looking kind of disfigured and very, very vulnerable and sensitive to that. It really impacted his heart so much. And so we were so proud of him. He really dug in and did the work. He graduated on time after missing several months of school, but did the whole year from home, where teachers from his school came to our house. And he wasn't safe to go into school yet because his balance wasn't great. He had peripheral neuropathy. He was a risk for falling, a risk for seizures. And so that year was so much. It really took so much out of him. And just to be an onlooker and obviously a mother, it was devastating because he had a lot of things that he had hoped to do in the future that were definitely redirected, if not completely taken off the table. And sports and things that he really enjoyed doing really were not ever he was never going to be able to perform at the same level. His cognitive response was impacted. So he was a really bright kid who was capable of doing amazing things, but a lot slower following the accident.
That would be a difficult thing for any person to rehab from, but especially at 17, that is still such a formative part of a person's life. I cannot imagine.
Yeah, it really was a lot. And I think that when he started to kind of get more comfortable with his new normal, by that point, he had been on a variety of medications for the aftermath of that accident, including opioid pain medication, benzodiazepines for anxiety. And so I understand that doctors by that point, so this is 2017, and that's around the time that a lot of the attention was being brought towards the overprescribing of these medications. So I think that his physicians were reacting to that, and appropriately so. But I think they could have been more compassionate and a little more mindful in the tapering process for him. I think that for him, the pain was still there, and the issues that he was needing those medications for were still present. And I don't know that they did a great job in setting him up with alternatives. I think they just sort of said, you've been on this long enough, we're not prescribing it anymore. And so it wasn't long before we knew that Benjamin was suffering with dependency, that he was turning to he had found alternatives, and that he was probably reaching out for medication from other people. And then it really was a downward spiral. The year after his accident, what we watched him go through physically, mentally, and emotionally, I think eclipsed what we watched in the year following his accident. It was just devastating. There were many, many, many days where he would be having some sort of an episode, and he was just in such a deep grieving state. And he says to me this one time, it just broke my heart. He said, "Mom, why is it so hard for people to love me?" And I thought,
Well, it's a
wow,
tough question.
yeah, it was. And I think I told him something like, well, Ben, you need to step out of the shadow that you're in right now, because when you step out into the light, everyone will be able to see you, and they'll know how beautiful you are. And you got to come out from that shadow that you're standing in. I think, and I think I wish in retrospect that I just said, like, I love you, like, I love you so much. But I tried to find some, statement to kind of to really impact him. And so there were many days like that, though, where he just was intoxicated, and he was just crying and crying and crying, and just, you didn't even know what to say to him. And then we would, try to get him into programs or try to get people to intervene. And, you know, the, the system is just so complicated. If you take him in for a mental health assessment and he says just the right thing, then they're not going to do anything without his consent. They're not going to force him to do this or that. And, I meet so many mothers now who are like, we begged the police to put him in jail. We begged them just to put him somewhere where they'd be safe. And they just, at every turn, we just had to sit back and take whatever resources we did, limited disposal. We just had to figure out how to save our child without any of the people who were in the best position to do it. It was so frustrating, and it's heartbreaking.
So at this point, it sounds like he had already he was past 18, so he did have a say in what he would or would not do, and that limited your ability to guide him. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. And as a result, we just had to wait for that day for him to come and say he was ready. And he did. And that is when we got to see the warrior that we watched defeat all the obstacles that were presented following his accident. We got to watch him kick into that gear again. And he admitted himself into a program. He had opportunities to discharge before he did. He opted to get in touch with insurance and look into extending, and then went into like next level treatment, and then decided to go to sober living, which, if you're not familiar, it's, I guess, the equivalent of like a halfway house where you are going to be living with other people who are trying to maintain sobriety. And it's an extra layer of accountability. And Benjamin was even thoughtful enough to say that he wanted to go into a sober living facility that was far away from Lake County where we lived. He just didn't feel ready to be reacclimating to the environment where his addiction was at its worst.
Mm-hmm.
And
That
he
makes
spent,
sense. That was a very mature choice on his part.
definitely, we were really proud of all the thought that he put into his recovery. And if you look at him on his social media, he was always there, like, proclaiming his 1 year or 1 month or 6 months, and putting encouraging statements on his social media for others who are suffering with, dependency. And he ended up becoming like a leader in many of the groups that he was in. Like, he got to do, like, he would be the person to run a group, or he got involved in an NA chapter out there, and he ended up becoming like a big leader in that capacity. He
That's
I
great.
have received endless messages from his peers that were in recovery with him talking about how Ben was the only one who would ever check in on me. Ben, he reached out to me on my 1 year anniversary or 1 year of sobriety and just, sent me a gift card for Starbucks and told me to have a good day. And just so many people have told me just the extent that Benjamin extended himself to them. And he was just a deeply loving, kind human being who had a lot to offer. And at the time leading up to his passing, he was finally making the decision to come back, and he was going to be back in the area, and he was looking to get a job transfer. He was working as a pharmacy technician out in the area that he had done sober living and was looking for a lateral transfer. And he said, Mom, I need to get a job right away. I need to fill my calendar up. I need to stay busy. I can't let myself get bored, because that's when these thoughts will creep in. And I just know that I have to be mindful about it. And so when he came home, he was immediately interviewing and had all sorts of big plans, was getting ready to start looking at his first apartment.
Wow.
But he did have a disability, and he had been determined by physicians as well as um, the Social Security Disability Administration that he was never going to be able to work like a 40-hour job. He was
Mhm.
never going to be able to, there were certain limitations as to what he could do in the capacity as a pharmacy technician. He was never going to be able to do a lot of the administrative stuff. Um, and so I think he was sad about that, sad that he, to some extent, would never be able to have a whole, fully independent life. But he was
Mhm.
eager to claim whatever independence he could acquire on his own. And so, but there was a lot of anxiety about him coming back here. Everyone felt it. And
Mhm.
I think the day before he passed away, he came home to visit with me. He was staying with his grandmother when he returned. He came over for dinner and we had chili dogs and we were watching a movie, and he says, you know, I need to find new friends. I don't know how to do that. Like, should I go to were there clubs, or like, how do I get connected to people my age who aren't doing drugs?
Mhm.
And so I said, well, start off by going to some NA meetings. I imagine that you're going to connect with people there, and don't be afraid to, invite someone out to, go play pool or go bowling or do something. I mean, you might have to push yourself out of your comfort zone a little bit, but I think that there will be companionship for you. And I'm glad that you're thinking about that. But he got invited to go to a hotel where there were people whose names I recognized. And the night that Benjamin passed away, he told me he was going to visit a friend of his who was in trouble. And he kind of framed it as if his friend might be suffering with addiction and that he might need somebody to and it's hard to say whether or not that was an honest, you know, answer, or if it was sort of a version of the truth. But he did, I think, because he was bored. I think he was lonely. I think he had not established that the things he needed in place to move forward in his sobriety. Um, he went out to this hotel, and it was getting late that night, and we exchanged a few messages, and I said, all right, well, if you're coming here tonight, I really need you to get home soon. And when he got home, he just seemed fine, like I think I suspected he might have smoked marijuana because I felt like I smelled marijuana on him, but nothing about the way he was holding himself was particularly concerning. And so, you know, I kind of offered him something to eat, and I told him, Ben, I'm worried that maybe you might be, in trouble as far as, your sobriety. I think tomorrow we should go to a meeting. And he agreed that we'd get up tomorrow and go to this meeting that I found online. And I hugged him, and we used to always say, like, I'd say, I love your guts, kid. And so I squeezed him and I said, nothing that's happened here is can't be fixed. You know what I mean? Like, this is
Mhm.
whatever's happened, whatever you're feeling right now, don't let it get to your head. Tomorrow's a new day. We're going to get up. You'll be fine. And he kind of shook his head and I could just see it in his eyes, though. He was so deeply ashamed. I just knew it. And I wish I would have, more than anything, I wish I would have I was tired and I was late. I was kind of frustrated with him. And I just sort of took a little bit of I'll get to bed and we'll get up and deal with this tomorrow. And I still think to myself, why didn't I just offer to cook for him? Why didn't I try and pursue a more in-depth conversation? Who knows? I think that whatever Ben did that night was likely going to happen no matter what. But what we have learned just from breaking down the events of that night and text messages is that, Benjamin was in fact doing drugs that night, and that where he went and the people he was with, they were, that he somehow consumed methamphetamine, and whether that was in the form of a Adderall pill or street powdered methamphetamine, he consume that. And historically, Benjamin has had a very hard time with stimulants of any kind, coffee, Coca-Cola. He with anyone who has anxiety will tell you certain stimulants can really agitate your nerves. And I believe that he reached out to this guy for Xanax. We know he did. And that he planned to just come home and try and take the Xanax and wind down and just get up. And he knew that mom was on him. He knew that mom knew that something had happened and he was going to have to deal with that. But he came home and we hugged and said goodnight. And then he was dead. Then the next day I go to wake him up for this meeting and he's gone, and no chance of going to that meeting and getting back on the horse and trying again. And I think that's where my biggest disconnect comes with the hyper harm reduction mentality, which is that, we can't arrest our way out of this. We can't criminalize everything. And that makes the issue worse because someone like Ben did everything right. He did everything right by those standards. We had Narcan down the hall from where he died, but he was ashamed and he went into his room by himself and dealt with it in the way that he thought he could to get through to the next day. And the next day was taken away from him. And the idea that there are so many people just like Ben, or even people who've never done drugs before, there's an entire circle and community of people that are not really considered in the harm reduction mentality, like a safe injection site. If you think about it, there are people who live on the streets, don't have access to health insurance, don't have means to be able to really be able to respond to addiction in the same ways that young people like Benjamin could. He did have health insurance. He did have support in place. And so those people will benefit from something like a safe injection site. They will go there probably for a needle and a warm place to shoot up. But a young kid who's 15, 16 years old and steals $20 from his mom's wallet to get a pill is not going to get a ride to go down to a safe injection site and then do his drugs in front of a bunch of adults. That is not a logical expectation to have of many of these victims. And so it's just such a limited mindset that we can just create safer conditions for people to use drugs. And so it's frustrating to me, to say the very least, that when we know that Ben was the victim of a drug-induced homicide, Illinois says that this is a drug-induced homicide. Illinois statute says that when you give somebody something, an illicit drug or an illicit substance, and it causes their death, that is a crime. And it's clearly defined in our law. But at every turn, I've had to tug at the coat strings of law enforcement and even bring them things that I think might be of benefit. Resources, suggest that they talk to this person or that person. And it's been clear all along that there was never any intention of really investigating Ben's death. And I think where that really upsets me the most is that I believe it's largely in part because the victim in this crime was a recovering addict or an addict or suffering with a substance abuse disorder, however you want to frame it. But I want to challenge them. I want one of them to look me in the face and say that if the same drug dealer broke into someone's home to get money to pay for his drugs because he needed drugs so terribly that he couldn't be contained. That's sort of the mindset that these drug dealers are often, many of them, they're victims of trauma, they're victims of addiction, and they don't have the means to make better decisions. They're
Mhm.
governed exclusively by their addiction. If they broke into someone's home to steal money to feed that addiction, and the victim was an elderly man or a young child, and they just were in the line of fire, would it matter to you if they were that individual was suffering with any kind of addiction or mental health issue? People are in fact found guilty of crimes, uh, who are suffering from a variety of ailments. That does not diminish the crime, and it should not diminish
Mhm.
the entitlement of the victim to justice. I think those things can be considered when you're handing out a sentence. I think they can consider those factors, but to just categorically refuse to investigate a crime simply because in your mind there really wasn't a victim, I guess, is really, really, really frustrating.
Yeah, that would be hard. So, uh, the new legislation that just passed, do you want to discuss that a little bit and how you think that will help start to curb this crisis?
So certainly, I think we spoke briefly this afternoon about the Fentanyl Act that went into effect just a couple days ago. I think it was the day before yesterday.
Mhm.
And while I haven't had a lot of opportunity to like read through it in its entirety, my understanding interpretation of it is that it's going to look a lot closer at the money laundering operations
Mhm.
that are being utilized by the cartels to, obviously keep people off their trail. And I think that their goal is to start targeting that and utilizing that as a resource to obviously, hopefully, identify some of the players. It does say in the actual statement that it's anybody within the chain of delivery, which to me is very reassuring because that does mean that it's not just a goal of looking for this one, the diamond in the rough, the big guy at the very top of the food
Right.
chain. It's acknowledging everyone within. And I think they also talk about any of the funds that they're able to, seize will hopefully be utilized to create more support for responding to the fentanyl crisis.
Mhm.
So that is reassuring. I'm definitely going to spend some time looking through it and seeing how much of it, I can understand and really be able to hopefully discuss it with more detail. But it is reassuring that something like that is being done because it gives us
Mhm.
the feeling that this is being addressed and that there are, I would love to see them, I still feel like some of the legislation that we're really hoping to see passed includes, classifying fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction, classifying
Mhm.
cartels as terrorists. There's also a lot of legislation that could be passed as far as like how these deaths are classified. As we discussed when we spoke the other day, there is no recommended dose for or safe dose for an illicit drug. And when somebody dies at the hand of an illicit drug, it should be a drug poisoning. And I think that helps with stigma. I think it helps when these cases end up going before a judge and they have to potentially convict the drug dealer. I think seeing the term poisoning next to it I think it does sort of create a bit of it helps you frame the incident as it should be. And so a lot of families would like to see some of these other things come to fruition, but this is a good start. It's reassuring to say that they're going to start paying closer attention to some of these issues that we've been really begging for them to acknowledge. And I hope that there is follow through on it. You know what I mean? Like that's going
Mhm.
to be the important thing is to see that, they actually are doing something. I think that's the whole point with like drug induced homicide laws too, is just you have these laws and they can be tools, they can be resources. They don't always necessarily end in a conviction. They don't always yield that what you think they will. But if they investigate my son's death, for instance, they can get into his phone, they can look through his all the different things that are left at the scene, and learn something about the community and the problem and the issue itself that they didn't know before, that will help them the next time. I mean, certainly, I think most families will say that we'd love to see the drug dealer that gave our child an illicit drug behind off the streets where they can't harm anyone. Certainly there is an element of justice for our child, right? We're
Right.
human, and that is true, but it doesn't bring him back. And what this could do, though, is hopefully enable law enforcement to make strides to protect our community and protect other
Right.
families from this nightmare. And so
Yeah.
I got to meet with a state's attorney from a neighboring county, as well as a candidate who will be running for state's attorney in my county yesterday for lunch. And we talked a little bit about my son's case. We talked about the fentanyl crisis. We talked about how in this particular county, this state's attorney has been leading the state of Illinois with drug-induced homicide convictions, and he has identified an absolute link to his action and a reduction in deaths related to fentanyl or illicit drugs across the board. And I mean, that's very reassuring, and that's a proof
It's
is
really it's really encouraging. It's like finally you can see one positive glimmer of light that's coming from this.
absolutely. And so, there have been some positive things that have happened since we last spoke. I have hopefully been able to get a Homeland Security agent to facilitate my local law enforcement with the investigation of my son's death.
That's
Um,
great.
and
Wow.
I think that there has been some benefits to some of the people that I've aligned with. The Drug Induced Homicide Foundation has been essential.
Mhm.
And I think that my work with them this has absolutely just been the silver lining for me, because
That's good.
nothing about this process has been easy. Everything about it is painful, but I've found a place where I feel like I can be resourceful. And I know that there are many, many groups out there that have been formed by the loved ones of somebody that has passed as a result of illicit drugs. But there is no other foundation that I've identified that is it's direct in the whole goal of the Drug Induced Homicide Foundation is to support families as well as law enforcement in the aftermath of these deaths as it pertains to the investigation piece. And
Mhm.
you'd be surprised how many mothers, fathers, and family members don't even know that a crime has been committed, because the tone was set by law enforcement when they arrived at the scene and essentially made them believe that this is a victimless crime and that their child made a bad decision and it's a sad tragedy. And if you have something like the Drug Induced Homicide Foundation that's stepping in the very early stages of that, you can catch on real quick that, like, that's not true. You can challenge law enforcement respectfully, but with facts, and say, I was told when they came and talked to me right after Benny's passing that they would have to be able to prove that this individual didn't or did know that what he was giving Ben could hurt him, and that Ben did not know that it could hurt him. And I think even more specifically, he would have to know that fentanyl was present, and that Ben would have to know that it was not. Well, the Illinois state statute says nothing of the sort. That is not a necessary burden of proof. They literally have to prove that this person gave my son the drug that killed him. End of story. And so when you create that unrealistic lens to look through for us, that, well, that's impossible, or that they're going to
Right.
admit that, like, what are the chances this young man's going to say, yeah, you're right. I did, know that this was laced with fentanyl. And
Mhm.
we certainly can't ask Benjamin if he did or did not know.
Mhm. No, that won't
So
happen.
the Drug Induced Homicide Foundation is sort of intervening in those early stages so that the individuals that have experienced this can be armed with the very important and critical knowledge of what, in fact, their state statutes say. And essentially, like, if law enforcement hasn't asked for certain evidentiary elements like journals, laptop computers, things that most crime scenes, if you were any other kind of victim, that they would ask you for, when they don't collect those things from you, that you can say to them, I have these things. You should look through them. They might give
Mhm.
you information that will be
Right.
useful. So it's so critical, so important, so essential. And I'm just so proud of the work that they're doing and to be a part of it. And Terry Almanza, who is the founder, she was a 27 or 28-year veteran of the Chicago PD, and she experienced the unimaginable, losing her daughter. And she identified deficits within the department she was working with her colleagues, the people that, there's the brotherhood or the sisterhood that officers share, and to feel that they were not going to work for justice and work for the truth in her daughter's death. She stepped away. She created this foundation, and now she is doing work within all 50 states. She's a warrior. And I just think that it's such a critical piece that families need to know when this happens, that their child is a victim, even though
Mhm.
society tells us otherwise.
Yeah. That's an impactful story. I cannot imagine. I mean, it's hard enough on any parent, but when the parent was part of law enforcement and then they see it firsthand, that had to be doubly hard for them to accept.
Well, and to have this foundation where she's operating in this capacity, I can't say across the board, but I'm pretty certain she has shared that there has been, like, things that she's tried to do and include them in, and use them as resources where they've declined. And I'm sure that hurts on a level that we couldn't understand. But she's just brazen. I've seen her in front of courthouses where people are walking by and we're handing out literature. Well, she'll just walk up and stop them in their tracks and say, "I'm Terry Almanza. This is what we're here about today. And look us up on your, it's inevitable that some point in time, most people are going to be within a few degrees of separation from somebody that's lost their life in this way. And because of the shame that has been unfairly placed upon us, very few people are willing to put their neck out like that. And
Mhm.
my admiration for her knows no end. And she absolutely saved my life this year. Like, there's no doubt. I don't know what I'd be doing right now if I hadn't been able to connect with people. I mean, those grief groups are amazing, and people who can support you with their kind words and inspiration, offer those kind of things. But this was something tangible that I could do. And I felt like I was able to, like, really advocate for my child because I knew what needed to be done, what wasn't being done. I I absolutely know that in the city I live in, they've never convicted one of these crimes, even though we've always had some of the highest numbers of drug related deaths. And I think that because I connected with them and I've been kind of raising a fuss, they've initiated trainings for their law enforcement to understand the protocol that needs to be in place when they have respond to the scene for something like this. And so I know that, like, already Benny has touched the world and that he's making an impact. And I think that the Drug Induced Homicide Foundation has offered me that. They've offered me that ability to just step in and do something that really will, in fact, make a difference in a really profound way. And so, I've been really frustrated with local law enforcement, but I'm extended a great deal of grace and understanding. I know that law enforcement agents have their work cut out for them, especially in a community like where I'm at, where the culture of crime changes so drastically, but we do have a lot of issues with gangs and drugs and a variety of other crimes that are, really eating up a lot of time and resources. But we have
Well,
to shift.
yeah, one of the things that I just have to comment about is that this situation had to have been made incrementally more difficult because of defunding the police that we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years. These men and women of law enforcement, it was already a most difficult job, and then it was magnified by the fact that they had fewer people to do it, and they were spread so thin.
So
So,
true. And we actually live in a state where they enacted the Safety Act, which has created a great deal of controversy. And I think that some police officers believe that this is a bit of an anti police bill. Are you familiar with the Safety Act?
not very well, no.
It's basically removing bond. So basically, when somebody is arrested for a crime, it is basically you're either going to be detained as is determined by a state's attorney or released and brought back for your court date on an honor system, I guess. But the point is that it you can no longer just hold somebody just because with bond. So they no longer are going to be utilizing a bond as an incentive to get people to come back to their court dates, because they deemed that it was unfair that there are people who have their resources to post bond and people who do not, and that should not be the difference between you and fair, free, I don't know. So in our community, that's in place. And I think there is a bit of a disconnect between law enforcement and government as a result.
I'm just going to have to say that if I had been working in law enforcement and that law came into effect, I'm not sure I would have had the fortitude to continue doing that job. I might have wanted to look for some other profession. That would be very frustrating and difficult to deal with.
Well, I spoke with the state's attorney who I've been working with the closest, and he was a supporter of this. And he explained that this actually is better for crime, and that it actually puts a lot of pressure on the state's attorney's office to actually approve charges and or approve to holding someone who's accused of a crime. And so he says that the only difference is that they're not going to get away. They're not going to be released simply because they have the means to get there. He's like, so really that's the only difference. And that is not something that should really make that big of a difference. But most people argue otherwise, because I think some of the biggest crimes, some of the biggest, the crimes that have made the biggest impact are often done so by people who have very minimal means. I mean, you think about like how people end up in a place where they're committing really heinous crimes. Many times it is because they are in a place of desperation. Who knows? And so I think that bond in general is sort of like a safeguard. It's a safeguard because you don't want those people back out on the street. You know what I mean? Until they've been able to stand before a judge and they can determine what is or what is not. And bond in itself being sort of this insurance policy, like what are the chances that these people are? I would love to know the statistics of how many people come back for their court dates. And I don't have that information, but that is something for me to look into, is how many of these people are actually coming back. If you have to come up with $10,000 that you collected from a whole bunch of people and they want their money back and you post your bond, there's a good chance you're going to go back hoping to be able to collect it. Maybe not. But the point is that a lot of people view it as problematic. And I think it has sort of put law enforcement in a bit of a state. You know what I mean? They have opinions about it and they do feel like they're not being thought of in this process, you know?
Well,
So,
I can see that. I see that. So, well, you've given us some great insight today, as you did before. I thank you for that. It's been very informative, especially with this brand new legislation that has just recently been passed. So that was perfect timing. And I thank you for coming on and talking about that today.
and I appreciate you extending more of your time to me today as well. Like I said, I've been so deeply moved by the amount of compassion that you've extended to so many people who have stood in these shoes, and you've done so with, you know, just a great deal of grace and compassion, and it's deeply, deeply appreciated.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. It's been heartbreaking and heart-wrenching for me to listen to these stories as evidenced by some of the emotion that just you can't hold that back. It's just there, and you can't deny it or hold it back. So I'm glad to know that this has been impactful in a good way.
Well, they say that when, you know, there's things that are difficult to talk about or painful to talk about, you know, there's a lot of really unimaginable, terrible things that happen to people. And if you watch a documentary or you listen to a story, people will be like, I don't want to watch that. That's too painful. Like, gosh, why would you want? And I just think the least we can do for the people who lived through it is to see it, talk about it, think about it, and interpret it. And it does take somebody who's willing to kind of endure a little bit of that sting to stand up and say, this happened to somebody and it deserves to be acknowledged.
It definitely does. Dawn, thank you again for coming on today. It's been great. And I have a feeling we'll probably do this again down the road at some point, hopefully not too far down the road into the future. I'd love to have you back.
Well, I'd love to dig into that fentanyl bill a little bit more. I'll spend some time looking into it, and we can exchange some emails and at the very least get some understanding between the two of us. I'd like that.
I would too. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your day.